All right, so we're diving into something pretty fascinating today.
Yeah.
Haym Soloveitchik's essay, Rupture and Reconstruction. And it's all about how contemporary Orthodox Judaism has really transformed and
Yeah, how it's changed.
Exactly. And you might be thinking like, why is this topic so important? Why should I care? But think of it this way. It's not just about one particular community. It's a way to understand how any tradition changes when it comes up against like the modern world. You know what I mean? It's like
it's a case study. It's a fascinating one.
Absolutely. And you can learn a lot really quickly.
And what's so interesting is that right away Soloveitchik, he has this core idea, and his argument is that there's been a really fundamental change in Orthodox life, right?
Yeah.
It's gone from a kind of religious practice that was mostly, absorbed through custom and imitation, like, almost like a family tradition, but on a community-wide scale.
Yeah, like just growing up with it.
Exactly. And it's shifted to a way of being religious that's much more about interpreting texts and like really closely following written law.
And that changes the whole like feel of the whole experience of religious life, how you understand it, how you
live it.
Exactly.
Right.
So to give everyone a little background here, Soloveitchik is mostly focused on Orthodox communities with roots in Europe, places like Israel, England, America, and really events that happened within his lifetime. And he compares this newer way of being religious to how things were in those Eastern European communities back in, the century before. And he also makes a point of saying that Sephardi communities are kind of outside of what he's talking about, just because their interaction with modernity it's been more recent.
Yeah, they're in a different timeline.
Exactly. So our goal today is to really unpack this shift, figure out what's driving it, what does it look like in action, how's it affecting religious practices, like how does it change who the authorities are, how does it change education, how does it change even like people's sense of identity.
A good place to start, a really important place to start is with Soloveitchik's take on this phrase that gets thrown around a lot, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that Orthodox Judaism has basically just swung to the right.
Right. I hear that all the time, this idea of a swing to the right.
Yeah, and he says, there's some truth to it, but it's not the whole story. It's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so let's break down this whole swing to the right thing. Like, it usually means that there's more of an emphasis on strictness in certain Orthodox communities, but Soloveitchik points out that in some really key areas where modern Orthodoxy was traditionally different from, what used to be called ultra-Orthodoxy back then, things haven't actually changed that much. Like their views on secular education or their connection to Zionism in Israel, like those big differences, those are still there.
Yeah, those core distinctions are still very much in place.
Yeah. Like modern Orthodox communities, they still generally believe in the value of a university education. Maybe they're a bit more cautious about it than before, but they're still very much Zionist.
And if we look at the broader picture, right, the Haredi world, as it's now known, they still generally discourage higher secular education, although how that plays out can be different in Israel versus America.
Right. Different approaches.
So in Israel, it's usually a total rejection of secular education, whereas in America, there's more of a recognition that you probably need a college degree just to make a living.
Practically speaking.
Exactly. And so there are ways to, work within the system, but the underlying idea is still that secular culture isn't really something to be valued.
Yeah.
And then, on Zionism, by and large, the Haredi communities either opposed to Zionism, or at least they're not emotionally invested in it.
So it's not like those ideological differences have just vanished, about how to relate to the non-religious world.
Yeah, they're very much alive.
Right, exactly. But Soloveitchik really stresses that big changes have happened and they've affected both modern Orthodox and Haredi communities in a lot of ways. It's not as simple as one group moving more to the right ideologically.
What's so interesting is the example he gives, right? He talks about Lakewood or Bnei Brak, Humra.
Oh, yeah.
And Humra is a term for a religious stringency.
Okay.
And of course, Lakewood and Bnei Brak are centers of those more right-wing Orthodox communities.
Right.
So he's talking about how stringencies that originated in those circles, particularly when it comes to Shurim.
Yeah.
These are the minimum required amounts for certain religious observances like, how big a piece of matzah you need to eat on Passover.
Right.
Those kinds of things have now become very widespread in younger modern Orthodox circles, almost like taken for granted.
Interesting.
And he even mentions that there's often a time gap, about 15 years or so between when a stricter practice becomes common on the right and when it kind of filters down into modern Orthodoxy.
A 15-year lag.
Yeah, roughly.
Wow, that's fascinating. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Soloveitchik's main argument is that the big change here isn't just about doing things in a stricter way.
Yeah.
It's about the whole way religious life feels, the nature of spirituality itself.
Yeah, it's much deeper than just ideology.
Exactly.
Well,
much deeper.
And this brings up a really important question for us to think about, right? How has the role of religious texts changed in all of this?
Right.
Because after all, Jewish life has always been guided by halakha. Right. Which is, the whole system of Jewish laws and customs that come from the written tradition.
Right. The Talmud, its codes, like all that stuff. That's been central to Jewish life for centuries.
Exactly.
So it seems obvious, right? Like, of course, texts are important.
But Soloveitchik makes a really important distinction. He differentiates between halakha as like a whole way of life, something that you learn by being surrounded by it, yeah, by watching, by imitating, like, almost like absorbing it from your parents in your community.
Like you were saying, growing up with it.
Exactly. Versus halakha as a set of rules that are mainly understood and applied through interpreting those religious texts.
Okay, so two different ways of approaching it.
Yeah, two different ways of living it and understanding it.
Got it.
So he uses this example, and it's a really good one, separating bones from fish on the Sabbath.
Okay.
Now, traditionally, in Ashkenazic Jewish practice, which is the tradition of Jews from Eastern and Central Europe,
yeah,
custom played a really, really big role, right? It was seen as this correlative datum of the halakhic system, which is a fancy way of saying that the written law was often understood and even reinterpreted in light of what people were already doing, the traditional behavior.
So the fact that Jewish people have been, eating fish on the Sabbath for generations and obviously taking out the bones as they ate, it almost became its own kind of justification. Like, it was hard to imagine that something so widespread could be really wrong.
Right. It was just how things were done.
It was just the way it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Soloveitchik contrasts this with the next generation, specifically with the Mishnah Berurah, which is this incredibly influential work of halakha written in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it really shows a shift away from that automatic justification of existing practice.
Right.
The author, the Hafetz Haim, he looked at the entire body of written law, and he tried to prove that eating fish on the Sabbath could be justified, could be plausible, based only on what was written down.
So not just because everyone had always been doing it.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. So common practice, it didn't have its own validity anymore. It had to be explicitly backed up by the text.
That is a huge shift. Like, suddenly we've always done it this way isn't enough. Right. You have to show me where it is in the books.
You need textual evidence.
You need a paper trail.
Exactly. And this leads to another really interesting thing that Soloveitchik notices, which is this explosion of halakhic literature.
Oh yeah, tons of books.
Yeah, tons of books. And what's so interesting is that he's not just talking about new books that deal with modern challenges like the laws of the Sabbath when it comes to electricity or whether new products are kosher, He's talking about this huge increase in books that focus on very basic, fundamental religious practices. Things like talit and tefillin.
Right. The prayer shawl.
Yeah, the prayer shawl and phylacteries. Okay. Things like the details of daily prayers. The right way to observe, major holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Passover. Like things that Jews have been doing for centuries.
Right. Things that seem pretty well established.
Exactly. Practices that were just, you kind of knew how to do them, but now they're being scrutinized in this incredibly detailed way.
And these books they're selling like hotcakes, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, they're incredibly popular. Soloveitchik, he talks about, just the sheer volume of these works being bought and adopted by people. And it suggests that there's this widespread need to reevaluate tradition. Like a lot of people are thinking about these things and questioning them, or at least there's a lot of people who agree with this new way of looking at things.
Right. They want that level of detail.
Yeah. And what's important to remember here is that this whole critical examination of these practices, it didn't come from from more liberal parts of Orthodoxy, right? It
Yeah.
came from the more traditionally observant Haredi world.
Right. From the right.
Exactly. From important institutions like Kol Haizon Ish and the Lakewood Yeshiva, from people who were known for being very, very strict in their observance.
Right. Absolutely.
And often these new stricter interpretations, they focused on areas where almost everyone was already following the rules.
Yeah, it was like a total audit of religious life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the example is Shurim, those minimal required quantities we talked about. It really shows how profound this shift is. So, think about the smallest amount of matzah you have to eat on Passover to fulfill that religious obligation, right? Traditionally, people just knew how much that was because they saw their parents doing it. They saw their community members doing it year after year,
Right. It was just part of Passover.
It's just what you did. It was transmitted through imitation, mimetically.
You just saw it.
Exactly.
Okay.
But around 1940, Rabbi Yeshayahu Karelitz, who's known as the Hazon Ish, and he became this incredibly influential figure in the Haredi world. He started questioning this accepted standard, this size of a kazayit, which is the basic unit of measurement in Jewish law, usually translated as the size of an olive. He argued that the traditional understanding of how big that was way too small.
Interesting.
And he insisted on a much bigger amount of matzah being the minimum. Yeah, and what's so striking is that this stricter standard, it started being adopted in lots of religious circles, especially among younger religious Jews. It's really common now. And it's this perfect example of how even traditional practices, no matter how old they are or how widespread they are, they now have to bow down to what's considered the correct understanding of the written sources.
So the text is king.
Yeah, exactly. The text trumps tradition.
Wow.
And this whole thing, it's had a really big impact on the role of the home in passing down religious practice. Soloveitchik, he really emphasizes that this decline of the home as the main place where religious authenticity is validated, it happened first and foremost within the Haredi world itself.
Right. And I think it's interesting how you were talking about it before, like you put on your socks and tie your shoes. Like religious life used to be something you just absorbed it as part of daily life. You learned it through habit, through
By
watching.
second nature. Yeah. It was just how things were done.
But now it's more of a conscious choice, You have to know the rules. You have to understand them.
Right. It's much more deliberate.
Yeah, much more deliberate.
It's a decision.
It's not just something that happens to you. It's something you actively do.
Exactly. And even something as simple as wearing a talit katan, that fringed garment that a lot of observant Jewish men wear.
Right.
It used to be just, you put it on in the morning as part of your routine, but now it's become much more of a ritual object. It's about following all the specific rules from the texts. It's not just a habit anymore.
So even the small things are getting
more codified, more regulated.
Yeah.
And the authority of custom, it really diminishes when it bumps up against the written law,
Yeah.
While custom might still lead to more stringency in some cases, if a long-standing custom contradicts what people understand as the clear meaning of the written law, well, the custom, it almost always loses.
Wow.
Yeah.
A text wins.
Text wins. And Soloveitchik argues that the real power of custom now is mainly in its initial resistance to change. Like the idea that things could be different from what we're used to, but
Yeah.
once that resistance weakens the force of habit, it kind of fades away.
Right. Like people get used to the idea that it's okay to change things up, to do things a little differently.
And then it's just a matter of following the text.
Okay, so this new focus on textual authority, it seems to go hand in hand with this trend towards stringency that we were talking about. The humor.
Yeah, the humor. Now, Soloveitchik, he recognizes that there might be some social reasons for this trend, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's about a group wanting to set themselves apart, to be different.
Yeah. Like to stand out.
Exactly. Or maybe it's a kind of religious one-upmanship where people are trying to be more observant than their peers.
Oh yeah, like a competition.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
But But he also points to what he calls an immanent factor, which is the inherent dynamic of theoretical knowledge itself.
Okay, so it's not just social pressure, it's also something about the way knowledge works.
Exactly. It's like once you establish a principle through interpreting text, there's this kind of logical momentum that pushes towards the strictest possible application of that principle.
So it's like the logic itself is driving the stringency.
Yeah, exactly. And what might have initially seemed like a reasonable middle ground can start to look like a compromise. And then the more extreme positions starts to seem more logically consistent and therefore more justifiable.
So the middle ground starts to look weak.
Yeah. It's like, if you really believe this principle, then shouldn't you go all the way?
I see. And he connects this to legal ideas too, right?
Yeah, he brings up this legal concept called maximum position compliance. Yeah. Where there's this natural inclination to go with the strictest possible interpretation of a law, just to be absolutely sure that you're fulfilling the obligation, completely and without any doubt.
But no wiggle room.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so cover all your bases.
Right.
Got it.
But this whole idea of relying more on textual transmission for practices that used to be learned through imitation, well, it creates its own challenges.
Yeah, because you're not just watching anymore, you're reading and...
Yeah, you're trying to learn from a text.
Right, and that's gotta be harder in some way.
It is. Language, even when it's trying to be super precise, it's not that great at teaching practical skills.
It's true.
And Soloveitchik, he puts it really well. He says, try learning how to tie your shoelaces from written instructions.
Yeah, it's so much easier to just watch someone do it.
Right.
You learn by seeing.
You learn by doing, by watching.
Exactly.
And so when the main way of learning how to do religious things shifts to relying only on written descriptions, well, it's easy to see how different people reading the same text can come to different conclusions about how something should be done.
They might interpret it differently.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That makes sense.
And this leads to a period of what Soloveitchik calls destabilization of practice.
Destabilization. Okay.
Yeah, where traditional religious objects and the ways people do things are re-examined in light of these new textual standards, and a lot of times they're found lacking.
Not good enough.
Yeah, not precise enough, not in complete agreement with the literal wording of the law as it's now being understood.
Right.
And this can lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, especially for people who grew up in the older, more custom-based religious environment.
Like they're used to doing things a certain way, and suddenly
it's all being questioned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's gotta be jarring.
It is. But for people who are embracing this new text-centered religious culture, there's this very powerful ideal. And it's this ideal of perfect accord between precept and practice.
So everything you do is perfectly aligned with what's written down.
Exactly. And it's this idea that you're supposed to meticulously translate all of this knowledge of the divine law that you get from the texts into your actions.
Yeah.
You have to perform the rituals in the most accurate way possible. And this leads to what Soloveitchik calls a performative spirituality, where the act of performing the rituals correctly, with all the details, it becomes a really important part of the spiritual experience itself.
Like the act itself becomes spiritual.
Exactly.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And another really important part of this whole transformation is what Soloveitchik calls the diminution of otherness.
The diminution of otherness, okay.
Yeah, and it's basically this idea that as religious practice becomes more integrated into, like a regular middle class lifestyle, you know? Like kosher food is available everywhere now. You can find it in most supermarkets.
It's easy to be observant in a lot of ways.
Right, exactly. And so the degree to which being observant sets you apart from the rest of society, it lessens.
Yeah. You don't stand out as much.
Right.
Okay.
And Soloveitchik argues that it's not just that the same level of religious practice is now less distinctive. He says that historically the amount of religious practice that made traditional Eastern European Jewish communities different was actually bigger.
Oh, so they were even more distinctive.
Yeah, they were even more distinctive because Mimetic tradition, it didn't always draw a clear line between essential religious requirements and more like folk practices, especially those practices that were tied up with all sorts of rituals meant to ward off evil forces. Those things were just part of life.
Yeah, it was all blended together.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
But modernity, with its technology and its more, scientific view of the world, it's made a lot of those prophylactic rituals kind of obsolete.
Right, because we understand the world differently now.
Exactly. So with this erosion of internal differences, those traditional folk practices and the way religion was just woven into daily life, the religious community, it's kind of responded by intensifying observance in the remaining areas, the things that are still clearly religious.
So it's like a refocusing of energy.
Yeah, exactly. It's like as some of those differences fade away, the ones that are left have to become more pronounced.
More intense.
Yeah, more intense.
And this need to be different, to be distinctive, it's made even stronger by the way identity boundaries are changing in broader society. Soloveitchik, he points to those big shifts that happened in America during the civil rights and black power movements in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
And these movements, they led to this questioning of America's, sense of moral superiority and a weakening of those traditional ethnic solidarities that had existed.
Yeah, it was a time of real upheaval, of changing ideas about identity.
Absolutely. And during this period, intermarriage rates went up and people started to question a lot of those old assumptions about who they were and what it meant to belong.
And in this environment, the Holocaust, it started to take on this new and very profound meaning. It became this central symbol of Jewish suffering and historical experience.
And a very unique suffering.
Yeah, a singular kind of suffering.
Right. Like no one else had gone through that.
Exactly. And Soloveitchik, he suggests that this passionate insistence on the absolute uniqueness of Jewish suffering, it's a reflection of this urgent need for distinctiveness that couldn't be satisfied just by internal religious practices or by traditional communal life.
So you're saying that in a world where those old markers of identity were becoming less clear, the Holocaust became this powerful way to define Jewish identity?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And this whole thing ties into another big trend that Soloveitchik talks about, which is the increasing wealth and integration of the Orthodox community into mainstream society.
All right, what he calls embourgeoisement.
Exactly, embourgeoisement.
Yeah, he connects this to the decline of the ascetic ideal.
Oh, that traditional idea of denying yourself.
Yeah, the distrust of the body, the focus on self-denial is this path to spiritual growth. It's definitely less prominent now.
Yeah, and that makes sense if people are more comfortable materially.
Right. If they're not struggling as much just to get by.
Exactly.
Yeah. Historically there was this very strong idea of a constant battle between your will and your instincts.
Like you're always fighting against your desires.
Exactly. But modern Orthodox perspectives, they tend to be more balanced. They focus more on plain living and high thinking rather than this constant struggle against basic human needs.
Right. So there's more of an acceptance of physicality.
Yeah, I think so. And Soloveitchik, he argues that this greater legitimacy of physical instinct, it's a result of Orthodoxy's interaction with modernity, and the influence of this worldly kind of orientation.
So it's like the focus of religion's struggle has shifted, right? It's less about trying to transcend your body and more about trying to avoid cultural contamination.
Yeah. It's
in a society where there's a lot of acculturation, a lot of blending with the non-religious world.
It's about maintaining boundaries.
Exactly.
And the emphasis shifts from trying to achieve a kind of purity of thought to striving for a purity of outlook, purity of ideology.
Okay, so it's more about your worldview than your inner thoughts. Okay, that's interesting.
And in all of this change, this really rapid change, memory becomes this really important tool. Yeah. It's a way to hold on to some sense of continuity, of reassurance.
Right. When things are changing so fast, you need something to hold on to.
Exactly. And Soloveitchik, he observes how Haredi recollections of the past, they started to look a lot like the present that was emerging.
Right.
Especially after the Holocaust, which provided this really powerful narrative of victimhood and survival.
Right.
And historical writings now, they often serve to kind of reinforce contemporary identity rather than highlighting differences from the present.
So the past is used to validate the present.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, that's fascinating. And there's also been a pretty big change in the way people learn Torah, the way they acquire knowledge.
Right.
Traditionally, Lemon, that dedicated Torah study, it was often seen as this lifelong, almost meditative kind of dialogue with sacred texts. And the process of engaging with the text, that was just as important as the information you got from it.
Yeah, it's about the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now there's this growing demand for Torah knowledge to be really accessible, like in straightforward, easy to understand formats.
Right. People want it to be clear, to be readily available.
Yeah. And this isn't necessarily a replacement for that traditional in-depth study, but it's like a vital supplement.
Yeah, it's another way to connect.
Exactly.
And we see this flourishing of Havruto, those study partnerships, and tons of Torah classes and lectures popping up everywhere. And technology's playing a big role too, right?
Oh, yeah.
You've got audio recordings of lectures. You've got toll-free phone lines offering daily lessons on things like Daf Yomi, which is the daily page of the Talmud.
Right.
Or Dial a Mishnah, where you can get selections from the Mishnah.
Technology making it easy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Soloveitchik makes this really, really interesting point about language and culture. He talks about linguistic acculturation, which is, the fact that contemporary Jewish communities in places like America, they mostly speak English.
Right. It's the main language.
Right. Whereas in Eastern Europe, Yiddish was the dominant language among Jews.
Oh.
And he argues that this ability to really quickly absorb all this detailed halakhic knowledge, it's actually possible because the community has kind of unconsciously adopted the ways of thinking and learning that are common in the wider culture.
So they're approaching religious learning with the same kind of tools that they use for everything else.
Yeah, exactly. The analytical skills, the emphasis on information, it's all there.
Okay. That's a really interesting point. And the main place where religious transmission happens, that's changed a lot too, right?
Oh yeah, dramatically.
Religion's not really passed down through the home and informal learning as much anymore.
No, it's much more about institutions now, schools and yeshivas.
Right.
And the yeshiva, which was traditionally, a very elite kind of academic institution for studying the Talmud at an advanced level.
Yeah.
It's become this mass religious institution with this very clear goal of shaping young people into committed members of the Orthodox community.
So the yeshiva is no longer just a place of high level learning.
Right.
It's also about creating a certain kind of person.
Yeah, it's about molding the future of the Orthodox world.